Our next presentation would be presented by Kees, and it's a senior technical manager from bakery and confectionery in Europe, Middle East, and Africa from DSM-FIRMENICH in Netherlands. Kees, with more than 25 years of experience in baking industry and product development, he works closely with research and development scientists, product developers, and bakers to innovate and improve baked goods. His expertise includes reducing gluten, fats, and acrylamide, while enhancing taste, texture, and shelf life in bakery and confectionery products. He holds a Bachelor of Science and Food Technology from the College of Agrarian Technology in Delft. Before joining DSM-FIRMENICH in 2009, he developed ingredients and food solutions to the B2B ingredient sector, focusing on bakery, cereals, and snack products. He will present how to get a grip on the dough, understand the effect of enzymes and processability on the final bread quality. We leave you the floor.
Thank you, Regina, for the introduction. Makes me blush a bit. Bon dia, good morning. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite. My topic of my talk is get a grip on your dough. And that is basically understanding the effect of ingredients and most likely enzymes on dough properties, processability, but also on final bread quality. So I like to dive a little bit more further in that. So looking to the content, I go a little bit back in the history of bread making process because that is quite relevant for to understand better my story in terms of enzyme technology. Then I like to discuss a little bit, as an example, two types of mixing systems, because you can understand that the way you're making a dough has a big impact on the functionality of ingredients and most likely the functionality of enzymes. So I'm going to discuss two types of mixing, which is conventional mixing, like a spiral mixing, versus a 3D mixing system, so a high-speed mixing, which is often used in the industry. Ingredients for bread making, it all starts with flour, obviously. So I dive a little bit deeper in that. And what does it mean if you talk about balanced bread improvers or flour standardizations, or etc., because that is also quite relevant. More in detail about enzyme functionality in bread making processes. And then later I came with a couple of examples. What does it mean now in terms of, if you look into more details of energy consumption, of spiral mixing versus 3D mixing, and what does it mean on the effect of the final bread quality. So bread making, if you take three examples, coming from no-time dough up to sponge and dough processes, for the ones who are familiar in the industry, you have much more different methods than just the three I'm just presenting here. So you can also think of retarded dough, long fermentation times, frozen dough, extremely long fermentation times, and that all has an impact, of course, on the way you are using ingredients and specifically enzymes. There's a little bit of a rule of thumb: the longer the processes, the lower dosages of enzymes are applied, because they have obviously more time to work on the substrate as such. Mixing, very important. A lot of things what I'm going to tell today, you might already have heard it, but sometimes it's good also to recap and to repeat things, because then also you're starting to remember that, and that is a good way of learning. So mixing is very important, because at the end, the purpose of mixing is that you want to define a very optimized viscoelastic properties of your dough. You want to make a very strong network to keep gas holding capacity, and also you want to apply a certain redox system, so reduction oxidation. You want to oxidize your gluten network, but you also want to give certain relaxation to make sure that your piece of dough can ferment, it's starting to expand, so it is giving volume, and that all has an impact on your final property of your bread. So super relevant of that. And you can use different ingredients for this purpose. So oxidants like ascorbic acid, but also some countries it is still used, like bromate or ADA. But also reducing agent like a glutathione, but also think of L-cysteine or hydrolyzed gluten. But you can also add gluten if the flour quality is not sufficient enough to give certain functionality of your dough properties. So all together, that is really relevant to make sure that you optimize your dough properties. 3D mixing, for the ones who are familiar with that, often used in British-speaking countries. It was a method of making a bread by using a lower quality of flour. Pressure vacuum parameters are used, so you have a fast oxidation. That means you are creating a strong dough, and in the later phase of mixing, you started to vacuum, so that is expanding your cells. And by doing these processes, you are obtaining a very fine crumb structure for your final bread. Often higher dosages of ascorbic acid is used because you need to have a fast oxidation. Very limited time is used because you talk about roughly around 3 minutes of mixing time. And what is more important, the energy for dough development is roughly 11 watt-hour per kilogram of dough. And that is quite precise. So that means that if you're putting a certain energy input for your engine, that energy is translated almost one-to-one to your kilogram of dough, and that is relevant. If you compare that with spiral mixing as an example, and my predecessor already talked about different mixing systems in the industry, but I take spiral mixing as another example, that is a more gentle way of mixing because you are putting the flour in, you're starting to put water on top of that, they're starting to mix, so the flour has time to absorb all the water. That is good also for the hydration of your gluten, so they're starting to unfold. Then you start to oxidize, so it is a much more gentle way of mixing a dough. Less friction heat also exists there, and what is more important, there's less risk of an overdosing, of overmixing, because you have still a certain tolerance in your mixing system. Suitable for a broad range of applications. So if you make toast bread, thin bread, buns, brioche, most of them you can do that in a spiral mixing. But what is more relevant is that the energy consumption is roughly 4 times more compared to treaties. And what does that mean? That means that it is not meaning that the dough also absorbs 4 times more energy. Most probably you also lose a lot of energy during the mixing because the energy translation is not one-to-one in these mixing systems. And you can imagine that has a big impact, the two differences on the behavior of ingredients. Go a little bit back in the process. So how do we look at that from a micro scale point of view? So macro scale, you have a foam. You started to ferment, you started to expand, you started to bake. So you started to solidificate your liquid sponge. After cooling down, your starch tend to go back in its original form. You are starting to retrograde. You lose fresh keeping. So this whole process has a huge impact on behavior of different ingredients. Now, from a mesoscale point of view, you see that if you take a dough system, it is not like that all these loose components like fat particles, starch granules, etc., they're just floating in your system like in the sky. So they're all intertwined, so they're all connected. And that is exactly what you can see on a micro scale. So they're all bond together. So yes, you will find definitely loose particles in your system, but most of them are really interconnected. And that is relevant for enzymes to act on that. So wheat and flour, because it always starts with the base. A very simplistic way, we always say, if you have not a good quality of flour, then it's not so easy to also to bake a good quality of bread. So it all starts with that. But you can also see that the climate change has a big impact on that. I mean, if you look to the total wheat crop, the majority is going to the feed industry. The second part is going to the bread making industry, and a small part, we always make the joke in the biscuit manufacturing, they're wiping the floors of the mills, they collect the flour, and that goes to the biscuit industry because it needs to have low quality of flour, of gluten. But this climate has a big impact on the use of fertilizers. So more fertilizers are used. That has an impact on the quality of gluten. We already hear indications from customers that they say, they slowly see differences in the quality of gluten they are buying from the market. Because you can understand the type of fertilizers are used having a big impact on this. Apart from this, all this sourcing of wheat coming from different countries combined with all the conflicts in the world has also an impact on your wheat prices. If you look to 21, and then the conflict started in the Ukraine, you see that prices are going up. It started to flatten down again. But if you look to the trend of the last 15, 20 years, it goes up and down. Now, that is something mills and also specifically plant bakeries and bakeries needs to cope with that. And that is not easy because, you need to offer your price to your consumer as low as possible or for a fair price. And if you're depending on varying wheat prices, that has a huge impact. A balanced bread improver. There are companies here present. They know much more about how to build a very tolerant system for dough development or final bread quality. I'm not going to dive into that. So for me, it is more relevant to explain how we look at that from a builder point of view. So you have flour that is normally starting with gristing. So you have a variety. They melange in the mill. So they take different wheat varieties from the market. They start to mill different streams. They bring that back together to obtain a certain flour quality. Now, on top of that, you're starting to standardize that with ascorbic acid and fungal alpha malase. And why is that? Because, depending on the crop, your falling number is varying, and you need to standardize it to a certain number to make sure that you already have a flour which is comparable or due to certain specifications. If you look more to a bread improver on top of that, you're going to build it up with a xylanase. Sometimes you call it the pentasenase, hemicellulase. In our company, we call it always an hemicellulase, and we distinguish it slightly like hemicellulase is more an overall umbrella. We call it more like the classical derived type of enzymes, and the xylanase is more like a GM type of xylanase. But it depends a bit on the terminology, what is used in the industry. On top of that, glucose oxidase and or lipases. And on top of that, you can still use, of course, emulsifiers, because emulsifiers are still relevant. Despite the fact that there are a lot of possibilities to replace emulsifiers by enzyme technology, but in some cases you still need emulsifiers. There's also clearly a synergy between these two ingredients. So you also see the more you're combining things together, depending on your mixing system, your process, your application, the more complex these systems are becoming. And that is exactly what companies are doing, which are making these kind of solutions for the industry. So I touch upon a little bit the substrate for enzymes as such. An enzyme, biocatalyst, it's a protein. So that means it is starting the reaction. So you have an active site that is visible in the picture. And you can imagine if it is a protein and things are changing in the conditions like pH, temperature, or availability of the substrate, or you have inhibitors, your active surface is starting to change and the substrate doesn't fit exactly anymore in your enzyme. And then you lose activity. That is not good, because you want to have an efficient way of enzyme functionality. So you can tailor that by changing the conditions or adding more activity of coming from an enzyme. And the enzyme works continuously until some of the parameters are changing in terms of substrate availability, of temperature, or whatever. Most of the enzymes are denaturated after 65, 70 degrees, with a few exceptions. So that means that they work quite long in your whole process. And you can also imagine, and that is something I think we see here in this picture, everything what starts from mixing until you're starting to bake, your dough system constantly changes. You have yeast, you're starting to produce CO2, your pH will drop. Some enzymes, all enzymes have a certain pH optimum. So you can imagine if you are using an enzyme, a xylanase for instance, with a higher pH optimum, it will be not so very effective in the first stage of mixing. But during fermentation, it's starting to be more active because your pH will drop and then it is starting to be more active. So this interplay between all these activities is very relevant for formulators, because they need to understand exactly what is done in the factory to make sure that they can make a robust system which is capable from mixing till proving until the final product characteristics, to make sure that you have an optimized system in that sense. Maltogenic amylase, that is the block there between 80 and 94 degrees Celsius. It's quite a specific enzyme. There are many types of maltogenic amylases on the market these days. so to say, it doesn't have a big impact on dough rheology. There's sometimes some discussion about that if you speak to bakers. But basically, it is doing a job in a very short time temperature frame. So it is modifying your amylopectin, shaving off the branches of that, making starch less sensitive for retrogradation, and that helps in fresh keeping. Quite an interesting enzyme and often used in long shelf life bread. If we talk about substrates, we look and we approach it from the point of view that we talk about 4 different categories. That doesn't need to be per se coming from your flour, because you can also imagine if I'm adding egg yolk, for instance, milk powder in my formulation, oil, I also adding lipids. If I use different types of proteins for protein enrichment, it also has an effect, of course, on certain activities coming from enzymes, because a lot of enzymes, they do have certain site activities, so you might also add a little bit of protease activity in some cases. Now, how does it look like? Amylases, very simple. I already touched upon fungal alpha-amylase, one of the basic enzymes in the market. In the old days, a lot of flour was standardized by malt flour because you need to increase your diastatic activity. And by doing that, adding fungal alpha-amylase, you tailor-made your flour in such a way that you have a benchmark level of baking performance of your flour. Then you have beta amylase, by nature present in a sufficient amount. So that means that also you don't see often beta amylases in the market to tailor-made that, because flour by nature has enough beta amylase itself, so you don't need to tailor that. But you also have bacterial alpha amylase, for instance, and that is more for softening properties. And then you also have other enzymes like glucoamylase, making glucose, and that is also helping by fermentation and giving colorization, etc. So there are many types on the market from different companies, different suppliers, and some of them are comparable, some of them are different. But like I said, most of the companies who are making these solutions, they know quite well how to balance the right type for the right purpose. Non-starch polysaccharides, one of my favorite topics, because I think that is an underestimated category of enzymes. If you take flour, roughly 2 to 3% of the flour contains non-starch polysaccharides. So these are long chains of sugars, the arabinox islands. Not to confuse with bran, because the bran is taken off of your wheat kernel. It is also not starch, because it is a non-starch polysaccharide. So it is insoluble, soluble fiber material, responsible approximately for 1/3 of your water absorption. So 2% in the flour, responsible for 1/3 of your water absorption. So super relevant in making your dough. What is the aim of non-starch polysaccharides modifying enzymes? Really, in the shortcut, you want to solubilize water unextractable particles. Because you can imagine if you have small fragments which are not soluble, and you're starting to ferment, you have gas cells, they're starting to puncture like a balloon, and then you lose stability, so you lose gas holding capacity. So the aim is of xylinases to solubilize the unextractable particles into extractable particles. And of course that needs to be balanced, because it is not like you just use type A and B and then it solves all your problems. No, it still needs to fit in your whole process from mixing till baking. So that is, there's a lot of choice in the market, but the principle of this is just to solubilize water unextractable particles. Gluten modification, I already touched upon. You want to have an extensible dough, extensible, because then you can expand like a balloon. You blow a balloon, start to expand. But you also want to have a certain elasticity, because elasticity, you can also translate it to stability. So you can imagine, I have a full tray of baking tins. I move that to the oven. It's starting to shake. You don't want to collapse it, so you want to make sure that everything remains stable. So you need to have a bit of an stability coming from elasticity of your dough. And what the aim is of mixing, and by using oxidizers to optimize your viscoelastic properties of your dough to make sure that you have a balanced extensibility versus elasticity. I mean, if you have a lot of extensibility and you can blow after fermentation, so you have a big voluminous piece of dough, it doesn't help if it collapse if you started to put it in the oven. So you need to balance that. That is really relevant in this case. Now, one of the enzymes which is quite good in strengthening the dough, glucose oxidase, the name already says it. It oxidizes glucose and oxygen into hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is oxidizing your thiol growths, so it is making a cross-linking. So the SS bridges are reconnected and connected again. So the aim is making stronger doughs, but there is also a limitation in that, because you can also imagine if you have a fast oxidation in the mixing, and people who are working with glucose oxidases, they are familiar with that effect. You're starting to oxidize already in the mixing phase because there's a lot of oxygen there that is resulting in dough which is quite short in terms of very elastic, not so extensible, gives very stable doughs, but you also have limitations in volume because you're lacking a little bit in extensibility. Now, also here, there are different glucose oxidases on the market, and I have an example. What does it mean in terms of results in the final bread between two different types of glucose oxidases? Lipids, like I said, not only the lipids coming from flour, but in this case, very relevant, phosphogalactolipase. So especially the galactolipase activity of phospholipases is very relevant because they are converting digalactosyl diglyceride in digalactosyl monoglyceride. And this in situ created emulsifier is able to mimic functionality like datum, which is a synthetic emulsifier. Works perfectly, very robust, but it is not always helping in cleaner label solutions. And in this case, these kind of lipases are very useful in clean label solutions to mimic the effect of datum. The other side activity of phospholipase is making lecithin, of creating lysolecithin from lecithin. And lecithin is not so functional in dough stability, but has a function in softness properties. Now, how does it work? You have created your cells, you're creating an emulsifier, you have your polar lipids, they're starting to create a membrane around your cell, a lamelle. And by doing that, you're protecting the cells to coalesce when you're starting to ferment. So small bubbles remain small bubbles, they remain separated, and you give the ability that they can expand during fermentation. And that helps to create volume. So you can imagine, if you do not have this lamelle, they're starting to coalesce, they're starting to create bigger bubbles, you make them more sensitive for collapsing, and your dough will it's gone. So you lose volume. So it's quite relevant in giving stability. So now you also understand, I was talking about glucose oxidase giving stability, but also phospholipase is giving stability. So depending on the type of stability you're looking for, you can play around with these kind of functionalities, which is interesting. As an example, like I said, there are many enzymes on the world, on the market. Of course, better ones, worse ones, excellent ones. Not only from our company, but also from other companies. They have excellent products. As an example, especially for formulators, they do understand how to combine them. So if you take the example of two types of xylanases, a fungal and a bacterial, they do have a certain effect on extensibility, elasticity, but also the effect on the final bread, and they can combined. You see here two types of glucose oxidases. So type A is a very fast oxidizing glucose oxidase, so that means the more you put in, the more oxidation you get. The firmer your dose, the drier your dose with limited extensibility. Type B is in this case a glucose oxidase, which is a more sustained release of hydrogen peroxide. So if you have longer processes like retarded dough, chill dough, long fermentations, it's starting to slowly to oxidize. So you give the gluten the ability to unfold in your mixing, and then slowly your gluten starts to oxidize. So that is very helpful if you want to have stability in your final stage of proving before you're starting to bake. And a type of lipase. So how does it look in development and spiral mixing? Now, the dough temperatures are roughly between 23 and 24 degrees If you compare a negative control, all of them, by the way, have a certain amount of ascorbic acid and a little bit of alpha malase to standardize the flour. But on top of that, 2 types of silanases, 2 types of glucosylases, a phospholipase, and a balanced enzymes cocktail. And that is a cocktail based on the 5 single activities. And you can clearly see that this, oh, sorry, I thought I had a pointer. But this one, the top line, that is the bacterial silanase. In this example, it is showing that you have a quicker dough development. So you are starting to increase your temperature during mixing between 0 and 12 minutes, and that is an indicating that you have a faster dough development, which helps also in certain properties of dough handling and final bread quality. Now, that is all nice, of course. What is interesting to see the effect on mixing energy. You remember that I was saying in the beginning, you need roughly 44, 45 watt-hour per kilogram of dough. If I magnify this last part, you can see that specifically the bacterial silanase, so the top line, you increase roughly 10% of your mixing energy. And if you compare that with the fast-acting glucose oxidase, that is the blue bottom line, you actually decrease the absorption of energy with 10%. So you might say that the glucose oxidase is fast-acting, you create a dough in your 12 minutes of mixing, which is underdeveloped. That is not a problem, of course, because you have a balanced system. Why, in this case, the bacterial silanase is compensating, because if you put everything on top, and you can see that with the balanced enzymes, that is this line, you are quite on par of 44 watt-hour per kilogram of dough. So you balance that, because under mixing by a glucose oxidase doesn't per se means that you have a bad performance, because you might need that stability in your final proof stage. So again, balancing and optimizing your cocktail is quite important. So people who are working in a plant bakery, you do not buy a bag of flour from your supplier. No, there's technology behind that. That is important to mention, I think. A bit of recap what I already said. So how does it work? So cross-linking gluten networks, so making stronger doughs. And the hypothesis of bacterial silanase is you have an aerobinding silane that can be associated with gluten, because they can be connected. If you are able to cut there, you loosen up your gluten, you make more water available for gluten development, and it helps to have a faster dough development. So by adding these 2 types, you can have a very nice functionality of that. Now, all great, of course, but what does it mean? Yes, I'm very aware the bread looks awful, but it is not the aim. The aim is to show the effect. What does it do on volume? So spiral mixing open top, the negative control, which contains a bit of ascorbic acid and alpha malase, is normalized on 100%. I took 3 examples. So that is the bacterial silanase, glucose oxidase, the fast-acting one, and the balanced system. And you can clearly see that this dough is underdeveloped because you're lacking in volume, and that is quite significant. And yes, it is also not helping in stability because you do not have an optimized dough. And this is also a straight dough, so you do not have a long fermentation. So the glucose oxidase does not have the time enough to give functionality over this time frame. If you look to C-cell numbers, that is more relevant because especially in the industry, we like to have a fine crumb structure if you talk about packed bread, because that is referred and related to long shelf life, softness. The more cells you have, the thinner the cell walls, the more resilience you have, the more softness you have. So the numbers you see on top of that, these are the number of cells counted by a C-cell piece of equipment. But you can also see that the number of cells is not always related to the volume. So in this case, for instance, you talk about more than 15% of more volume compared to the negative control, but the number of cells is now less than 10%. So it is not always like the more you add, the better the result is. Now it is all about what is your aim? What do you want to achieve? How do you want to process it? If I make a dough of 40 kilos or I make a dough of 500 kilos, that is a big difference because you have a head-tail effect. that has a huge impact on processability, and that has a huge effect on the way you are composing a cocktail as a bread improver. So that is really relevant in this case. If we compare that with crumb structure on, is this for me or not? Oh, because I thought, no. Oh, it will in 1 minute. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'm already speeding up, so that's good. So what does it mean on crumb structure? Going back to the effect of mixing. Remember, you need 4 times more energy of spiral mixing versus 3D mixing. And for the ones who are used to 3D mixing, they recognize that. That is super interesting. So in this case, same flour is used. So the bottom row, 3D bread, same pieces of weight. You clearly see that you already obtain more than 1,000, up to 1,500, 2,000 cells just by changing the way of mixing. And that is super, super important. And that is super interesting also to see what the effect is on mixing, despite the fact that you're using the same enzymes, the same flour, the same dosages, the same process in the way of processing it, but just the way of mixing, the same quantity of dough, huge impact on your structure of your dough. And then you might say, that is nice because you talk about the balanced enzyme. But yeah, that is not so shocking if I compare that with a single one. So why do I need then a balanced enzyme if I can already achieve a very nice cell count by using just a bacterial? But like I said, it's not only about the final results, it's also about processability, dough handling, stability, robustness. This is pan bread, but if you talk about batar, baguettes or whatever, it also depends how the shred is, the opening, the crust opening. All these parameters, they count on the choice of enzymes. Closed tin, obviously baked with a lid, of course, on top of that. Here you see clearly that the glucose oxidase, the fast-acting one, is not even reaching the volume because it is lacking in dough development. And if you compare it with a 3D, then this is impressive. So in this case, and I'm not saying this is an overall solution you can just simply implement in your plant bakery or bakery, but this is just giving the example that there is a possibility coming from 88 numbers. And if you talk to people from C-cell, they say, yeah, if you have more than 500 cells, it is humans can see the differences. So everything what is below 500 cells is not noticeable. So this is quite impressive. Not to forget, on top of that, you can still, or sometimes you need emulsifiers. So think of sliceability. I think it's a big topic in the industry. They want to get rid of synthetic emulsifiers for clean label. But also do not forget that CSL, SSL is giving nice features also to improve sliceability because you create some kind of a fill on your structure and that helps in sliceability. Also, certain types of multigenic amylases helps in this field, which is not helping in count numbers of cells, but it's also helping in resilience. So that also is helping in sliceability in that sense. I'm getting a bit nervous from you. I have 2 minutes, I see, all right. For the people, they discover that here, there's a bit of a dense layer here. And you might say, hey, that is weird. Is it undercooked? No, this means that there's so much power in your bread that, and it is topped off with the lid, that your bottom is starting to collapse. You're starting to compress your bubbles, and that is resulting in a very compact layer. So in this case, you might say, the dosage of a phospholipase in this example is way too much. I want to leave you with some take-home messages. First of all, assess the quality of your raw material. Very, very important. I do know that flour mills, they sell the products on specification, and they are very capable of standardize that. But do not forget protein content and wet gluten index, etc. does not always per se say something about baking performances. So that is really, really important to understand your raw materials. Define the important quality aspects. Everybody always say, I like to improve my product. Yeah, in what? in volume, texture, softness, shelf life, crispiness, hardness, crust opening, whatever. You need to be very clear on that. I can tell you, I have less experience than Marcel, but I can tell you that I have seen examples where we showed improvement and then the customer said, yeah, but it's not the same anymore as a reference. No, because you want to have improvement. It's more softer, it is more this. Yeah, but we like to have softness, but not in the first 7 days, only in the last 7 days. Yeah, be clear on that. Really define what is improvement. That is really important. Recognize that the type of mixing and process is really important. That is really defining your functionality. Also, do not forget, there are a lot of habits in the baking industry. We do things because we do. Like it is history. Yeah, my father was already doing that. My grandfather, my predecessor was doing that. But sometimes if you look to your process in a critical way, you can make big steps without using any additives or ingredients, just by optimizing your process. That is really helpful in that sense. Understand enzyme functionality. Yes, because I talk about enzymes, but also understand, of course, functionality of other ingredients and make sure that you optimize that. And the last one, accept that the art of bread making still holds undiscovered secrets and potential for innovation. That's it. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Now we will start the roundtable session to ask questions to our speakers. So we ask the audience to feel free, do not be shy, to ask questions even in Spanish. Do not worry, we can translate it. Any questions from the audience?
Hello, good morning. Irene Mínguez from Grupo Bimbo. Thank you very much for all the panelists and thank you for the clearness of your presentations. They have been very interesting. I have questions for all of you, but I do not want to monopolize the microphone. First, maybe for you two, you just gave your speak. I would like to assure that regardless of the market prices and the pressure that we get, the reduction of the qualities is never an option for the producers. So I just wanted to comment on that. And a question, what is the activity of the enzyme after baking? Does it remain active over the whole shelf life of the product? Because we would like to maintain the quality over the whole shelf life of the product. So.
Yes, so we have measured the activity, so the enzyme is active during proofing and early stage of baking. And of course, as you saw, we had measured the sugar after baking, and we have actually followed it during shelf life also for 14 days. And we didn't see an increase in the sugar. It was just noise in the level, so it was the same.
Do you also measure enzyme activity or only in another way or only the
No,
sugars?
we usually use to follow the development of sugar afterwards. We don't measure the sugar. The assays are it's not that sensitive, so you wouldn't be able to detect the enzyme activity in those.
Okay.
Even though we have really sensitive ones, but you don't. It's so diluted. It's really small amount of enzyme you actually add.
Okay.
So we choose to follow it with the sugar in the bread.
Okay, thanks. And maybe a question for Marcel and for Kees. Is there, well, you know that when we scale up products, many times we see differences between what we see at the upscale results and the results that we had in the pilot plant. So is there any equipment for dough quality analysis that you recommend before upscaling to measure the activity of enzymes or improvers in general, like the ones that are used for flour quality but specific for dough quality?
Yeah, no, for me, I don't think that's possible. We try to mimic the process as good as possible. So we try to cooperate with our customers and analyze the process. And then we try to mimic the process, also the damage of the dough during extrusion process. And we try to mimic that, and yeah, we have not seen problems when we translate that to the production. But the problem is that we're not often allowed to go into production anymore. We first need to go to the lab for Bimbo, for example. So we prefer to use our expertise and go with the customers to the line, analyze it, and then we do our homework and come back. And I've never have had much problems to work with this method. Yeah.
Yeah, to add on that, Irene, so good question. And I always agree with Marcel, first of all.
As principle.
And I think you always cannot avoid that you always have a scale-up issue. I mean, if you do lab trials, it's giving a guidance, obviously. But if you're really talking about industrial scale, like maybe 50, 100 to 300 kilograms of dough, that is really a big difference. So it involves much more than just a simple baking trial in that sense, in controlling that. So it's difficult, I think, to translate that.
So no dough analysis.
No quick solution.
No quick solution yet.
Okay. Thank you.
One question for Hendrik. Hendrik, yeah, when you, for example, if you have a hamburger bun recipe and you reduce the sugar with 50% and increase the water, and the enzyme is active more in the final fermentation and the baking phase, then of course in the dough the water activity is higher, I suppose. Do we need to compensate then the dosage of the enzymes or of the other enzymes? Do we need to lower the enzyme content because they can accelerate? Have you looked to that?
Good question. I wouldn't say that's something that we have studied. We haven't adjusted any of the background enzymes or the other enzymes, so we have added it on top of the other solutions. So we haven't done any adjustment and haven't found a need for it either.
No, but especially with the process, for example, for hamburger buns, where you have a dough.
Yeah.
It sits in the dough pump for 10 minutes and then it goes to the extruder. And when you add more water, I can suppose that the smoothness of the dough slightly changed.
Yeah.
Or changed. What's happening then? And maybe I need to reduce the other enzymes to get the dough characteristics at the right level. That could be possible. Maybe.
Yeah. It's something we have studied, so yeah.
Hello, good morning. I have a question for Marcel. You gave a few examples of encapsulated enzymes. Do you see still other enzymes that you think would be interesting to encapsulate to create new properties during the whole baking process?
Yeah, we now use mainly amylases and xylanase cellulases because these are the enzymes which has the most influence on your dough properties in the earlier stage of the process. So the other enzymes, I think that you really need to dose on the strengthening effect, like the lipases and GOX, which Kees explained. It's very important to have the balance. Maybe, I don't know. We only use it for a few enzymes where it makes sense and we really have benefit. And sometimes we have enzymes from other food applications which doesn't give us the right dough characteristics. And then if the beneficial softness, for example, is big enough, then we start to matrix encapsulate. Yeah.
My question is for Peter Shuri. I found very interesting your presentation today. I think it's wonderful that you're raising awareness of the nutritional value that wheat contributes to the human diet. Interesting to see that the people who are claiming to be sensitive to wheat, the number you put on a question mark was 6%, which is 3 times as much as the people who are actually diagnosed with celiac disease. If I understood correctly, your work essentially is many of these people are actually not really suffering the sensitivity. Maybe a portion of it is connected to the impressions. Where is this coming from? And I guess my bigger question is there anything maybe academia or even the industry should try to do in order to help, maybe spread a better word on the benefits of wheat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a doctor. But I don't think we're surprised because, there's a lot of interest in psychosomatic illnesses nowadays, which means that people have the symptoms. There's just no physiological basis, and I think this is very similar. We did have a psychiatrist, sort of a social scientist in health grain, and his view was that people can control their lives through their diet. And therefore, a lot of people take control of their lives through their diet rather than through anything else. It's a way of taking control, and it doesn't really relate. It could relate to sort of cutting out dairy, cutting out all sorts of things. But that was just his view. I think life's complex nowadays.
Just to understand, so are you saying that there is no physiological reason for some of them not to consume wheat, but they feel better?
But they have symptoms when they consume it, and when they know they're consuming it. I mean, the symptoms are real.
Yeah.
What's not explained is the physiological, is why, but the symptoms are very real, like other psychosomatic effects of food, or other psychosomatic sort of illnesses. Symptoms are very real. It's just they often can't explain them.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got personal views, which I probably wouldn't want to repeat.
All right. So, but what about any words or any thoughts about how to a bit influence the image of wheat in general? Because obviously it has a bearing, right, on how people perceived about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very difficult when you're working with white bread, because all the time it's being compared with wholemeal. And so I think often industries are sort of very reluctant to promote wholemeal because that implies that white bread is bad for you. And it's trying to get the balance right, that something can be perfectly healthy but can be improved. And it's getting that balance right, I think.
Thank you.